So, we left off with this question. Is it art? I think most of us would agree with the judge that Brancusi's Bird in Space is art. What about a feather that someone picks up in the forest, mounts on a stand, and labels it flight? It's not an entirely hypothetical question. The stone on the left was not manipulated by an artist. The human face was carved naturally by geological forces. Yet this pebble was found near a site in Africa occupied by early hominids. On the right, you see the Smithsonian's estimate of what they looked like. What intrigues archaeologists is the pebble was not found in a place it would have been deposited naturally, but rather near a site where these hominids hung out. So the impulse to, if you will, pick up a feather in the forest and attach some significance to it is very, very old. In this case, a mind-boggling 3 million years old. The very oldest art that might fit our big idea definition, where material was clearly manipulated by an artist, also comes from Africa. Archaeologists have found geometric incisions, cross-hatching, on rocks and eggshells. We really have no idea of what these carvings meant, but they almost surely represent some effort to convey an idea in symbols, a huge step forward for the human race and a precursor to writing as well as art. Drum rolls, please. Here is the very first work on the College Board's required works list and the oldest representational art, that is, art that depicts something recognizable to the eye that has been discovered to date. So let's stop for a moment and talk about what's going to happen when you encounter a required work in the readings and in my lectures. First, you want to record in your workbook the identifiers: title, artist or culture, date, materials, sometimes materials, and technique. And here is a warning. Over the years, the College Board has updated these identifiers. Frankly, sometimes they've had to fix mistakes. The disembodied voice, that's Mrs. McConnell, me, will not always update lecture slides to fix these identifiers, just as I don't always update video links on the slides. But as we introduce a new work, we will pause to help you write down the identifiers in your workbook and, if necessary, correct what's on the slide. You will also be filling out information on the big four: content, context, function, and form. We've talked about all of these now. Do not assume that we'll stop to fill in those blanks for you as well. That is your job as you listen to the lectures and do the reading. At the end of the class where we discuss these works, if you're still feeling confused, there may be time to return to these questions. We are also, whenever possible, going to pause and ask you to give a preliminary visual analysis of each required work. Put simply, what do you see? Put less simply, what do you see? And employ your art history vocabulary as you describe it. So let's practice here. What do you see? How would you visually describe this work? Well, it seems to be an animal with 4 legs and 2 horns. The artist doesn't use contour lines, but instead fills in the entire shape with color to create line. But the most important decision the artist made was to portray the animal from what perspective? The animal is depicted more or less in profile. So why do you think Stone Age painters always paint or draw in profile? We don't know for sure, of course. It may just have been easier. But scholars tend to argue that profile depictions were chosen because they conveyed the most information about the animal's basic shape. You've read about this work, and I don't have a lot more to say, except that the most likely questions about the work will involve its location, age, and status as the oldest representational art we've found so far. And now we fast forward 10,000 years to the second image in the College Board's required works list, the Hall of Bulls at the caves of Lascaux. Explorers began discovering prehistoric cave paintings in the mid-1800s. The consensus among archaeologists was that they had to be fakes. Prehistoric people simply couldn't have created such great art. And then in 1940, a French teenager, Marcel Ravida, was out walking in the woods with his dog, Robot, pictured here. When they came to a sunken spot in the ground, the dog started sniffing and pawing through the leaves. Marcel went to investigate, and he found a vertical shaft. 4 days later, he returned with an oil lamp and 3 friends. The virtual tour you're about to take will give you some idea of what the 4 boys saw that afternoon. We're going to talk more about this fascinating art, but first, a very quick history lesson, which for most of you should be reviewed. Historians divide prehistoric, pre-writing history into 3 periods. You really only need to know the Paleolithic era, where people used only simple stone tools, hunted or gathered their food rather than growing it, and lived in small family or clan groups, and the Neolithic era, or as is sometimes described, the era of the agricultural revolution. This is when farming developed and people began to settle into larger scale and more permanent communities. Today, and only today, we're hanging out entirely in the Paleolithic era. So let's start with visual analysis. What do you see? Well, the figures are painted in profile, but not perfect profile, since we were able to see both horns. On the largest bull, the artist has used strong, bold contour lines to define the figure. The animals overlap. Unlike the animal on the Apollo 11 stone, these animals are posed dynamically with outstretched legs that capture movement. The colors are earth-toned. I'll bet you came up with even more. When you write essays on your AP exam, and we'll talk a lot more about how to do this throughout the year, many of the questions will ask you first to present a visual analysis, supported by evidence from the work, and that's what you've just done, I hope. But the questions will very often go on to ask for a contextual analysis. In other words, what elements of the culture help determine the content and form of the work? On this slide, you see the opening statement of the College Board's curriculum framework for global prehistoric art. Note the phrase that I've underlined. This is contextual analysis. And to be honest, I think the statement is problematic. So, right off the bat, I'm introducing you to something that is a major emphasis of the College Board and of this course, learning about competing art historical interpretations of the work. I'm going to compete with the College Board. So here's my question for you. What do these extraordinary paintings say about the claim that survival was Paleolithic man's paramount concern? How would Paul Johnson, the author of the cave art reading you did for today, respond to the College Board statement? To understand how important the human impulse to create art really is, think about how hard it was to make these paintings and how much they cost a society with very limited resources. Some of these bulls are over 20 feet long. To paint them on the cave ceiling, artists would have to erect scaffolding. We know that, by the way, because we can still see the holes carved into the wall where the scaffolding went. As you saw from the virtual tour, these were painted in very dark, narrow, remote corners of a cave. To paint in this environment, artists needed to use torches soaked in animal fat, and they needed even more animal fat to mix with the pigments so that the paint would stick to the walls. Why was using large quantities of animal fat such a big deal? Well, fat meant calories, and for these people, calories meant survival. In other words, these paintings were important enough to Paleolithic people that they were willing to crawl into tight, scary places, to lie, kneel, or stand for hours on wooden platforms, and to give up a resource that might mean the difference between starving and surviving the winter. Why? Well, that's a much debated question. You're going to see a lot of video clips in this course. Let's turn to our very first from a BBC series called How Art Made the World. We'll see that art is, in terms of human history, a relatively recent development. The most famous section of the Lascaux cave complex is the Great Hall of Bulls. 16 different animals show up on the cave walls, but these are the biggest, and actually, they aren't really bulls. They're giant oryx, wild oxen that are the ancestors of domestic bulls, and closer to the size of a buffalo. Oops, here's another panel from Lascaux. What do you see here besides the flying bull? These look like horses, but actually they're early equines, or the ancestors of the modern-day horse. There are more than 300 equine figures in the caves. It's the most commonly represented animal, and they were not domesticated horses, by the way. Paleolithic people hunted these equines for food. Let me make another point, since this question has shown up on AP exams in the past. We know from carbon dating and other archaeological investigations that these animals were not all painted at the same time. So we can't assume that a particular collection of animals reflected a deliberate artistic composition. The artist may just have been looking for a blank space on the cave wall. So here we see oryx, horses, and deer. Why and how did Paleolithic artists choose their subject? To explore that, let's return to our video. I am about to make a very important point about all of the prehistoric art we will see in the remainder of this unit, so pay attention, okay? Prehistoric means just what it says. These are peoples for whom we do not have a written history. We do have a fair amount of information. We have carbon-14 evidence from archaeological sites, which gives us a pretty good idea of how old artifacts are. We can look at historic records from people who lived in the same area and try to draw inferences from similarities to prehistoric work. But these are just inferences, and they may be wrong. One reason I love to teach the cave paintings is that there are so many competing theories about what they could mean. And let's start with yours. Why do you think these Paleolithic Europeans painted oryx, equines, and deer on cave walls? Well, since you've already read about cave paintings, you may not have accepted my open invitation to answer that Paleolithic artists painted animals that they hunted. But at first, this seemed like the most obvious explanation. Let's return to the video. Here is still another image from Lascaux. I don't know about you, but I've never seen horns like that outside a Dr. Seuss book. Why might the artists have painted horns like this? What do you think those dots might represent? Another theory about the cave paintings was that the animals painted were power animals whose presence would protect the people or summon spirits. Or perhaps they were the reincarnated spirits of ancestors. Can you think of a character from popular fiction who has a stag as a power animal? Yep. The stag is Harry Potter's Patronus. The power animal or Patronus theory might explain why the stag has superhuman antlers. If you find this, or super stag antlers, if you find this intriguing, we put a Find Your Spirit animal quiz up on Canvas just for fun. This panel suggests another, though closely related theory, that cave paintings were created as part of shamanistic rituals, or to depict shamanistic visions. Shamans are ritual experts, often found in hunting communities, who enter into trance states in which they visit the world of the spirits. They take these excursions to retrieve lost souls of the desperately ill, to aid the desperately ill, to influence the weather, to oppose the forces of witches or evil spirits, even to negotiate with the animal spirits over hunting, returning us to the hunting theory through the back door. The relationship between art and shamanistic rituals will be an important theme in this course, especially when we look at non-Western art. Here's a terrific example which we'll encounter in the spring. During a potlatch ceremony, a dancer from this northwest coast tribe wore an eagle mask. When he pulled a string, the eagle transformed into the face of an ancestor, hence the name, transformation mask. One piece of support for the shamanistic ritual theory is that Lascaux artists painted in some of the darkest, most inaccessible corners of the cave. Bad places if the paintings were intended to be a classroom for young hunters, good places to conduct secret rituals away from prying eyes. Another piece of support for the shamanism theory comes from art produced thousands of miles away and thousands of years into the future. The San Bushmen of South Africa also painted in caves, but in this case, anthropologists were able to interview a few very elderly shamans who explained that these paintings were indeed records of shamanistic visions, and shamanistic rituals. And how about these remarkable works of rock art? Do you recognize either of these images? You can find both of them here in Utah. The Psychopomp, or Guider of Souls, and the All-American Man, which is found in a remote corner of Canyonlands National Park. These are prehistoric works as well, even though the so-called Psychopomp is only about 2,000 years old and the All-American Man is a youngster. Radiocarbon dating puts it at about 1260 CE. Were these shamans? That's one theory. The main reason I've included them is to point out that you don't just have to limit your rock art encounters to PowerPoint slides. Go take a hike. Let's go back to the Lascaux Caves Dr. Seuss reindeer. What do we make of the dots? Do we sometimes use dots to represent in paintings? How about stars? Here's still another theory, that some of the paintings were astronomical maps. A German researcher, for example, thinks that the cluster of dots over the bull's shoulder is the Pleiades constellation, as it looked 16,000 years ago. On the right, you see how the constellation looks today. Some cave painting sites seem to have been chosen because the setting sun lit up their interiors on the day of the winter solstice. We'll talk more about the relationship between art and astronomy in a couple of days when we look at Stonehenge. Before we leave Lascaux, let's look at just a few more famous images. Here again we see two oryx, or bulls. Take a look at the legs. What do you notice? The bulls appear to be moving, which is hard to do. And why are their legs crossed? This might not seem impressive, but in fact, this painting marks a huge artistic and mental breakthrough. We already talked about one fundamental challenge of any painting: how to convey three-dimensional reality on a two-dimensional surface. The way the artist has placed the animal's hindquarters makes one bison seem closer to the viewer, and the one on the right is painted on a section of cave that juts out, giving the impression that it's coming toward us. Artists wouldn't achieve this kind of perspective again, really, until the 15th century CE. Artists wouldn't get the leg movements right until the 20th century, when photographers set them straight. Here's another of your required works. You'll learn the story behind this set of photographs in our second-to-last unit. And now we come to what may be the most famous and controversial painting in the caves of Lascaux. It is not the required College Board image, but I did stick it into your workbook. What are we seeing for the first time here? And, I would note, for the only time among Lascaux's 2,000-some images, about 900 of them animals and the rest various geometric shapes. We're seeing a man. It's a very strange man, with the head of a bird and a rather prominent sexual organ. Some historians think that he's a shaman. We also see what looks like a broken spear and intestines spilling out of the bull. We can't know for sure, but it's possible that this painting is actually telling a story of a hunt, perhaps. That would make it a very early narrative painting. We've spent a long time on the cave paintings. I hope you haven't run out of time. We won't be able to indulge ourselves as much with other 11 images in this unit, but if we have time, I want to come back to the question that we began with. What is art, and why is it created? The AP exam no longer includes a quote-based essay, but I'm going to toss quotes at you throughout the year anyway, and here's the first. Alberti was a famous artist, architect, and art critic during the Renaissance. We'll encounter him again. He's the architect of one of our required works. For now, let's think about what he has to say. What does the first underlined part of his statement mean, in your own words? Basically, he's saying that art began by imitating nature. Not a bad hypothesis. Sorry, my iPad doesn't want to advance. But let's look at the second and more interesting part of the Alberti quote, which I've underlined on this slide. This is why a person finding a rock shaped like a human face doesn't make it art. The artist has to make a change, adding to or subtracting from what he or she sees. So what about that phrase, true likeness? What does it mean that a piece of art provides a true likeness? Could these both be a true likeness of a bird in flight? If so, what does true likeness mean? One possible definition is a work of art that captures what the eye actually sees. Art historians rather helpfully call this optical art, or even more commonly, representational art. Here you see a Dutch still life from the Baroque era, maybe the high point of meticulously realistic renderings, at least until the invention of photography. Look at the way the artist is able to capture transparent glass. Wow. But how does this early 20th century painter try to capture the true likeness of a war machine, an armored train filled with soldiers firing rifles? The artist clearly did not paint an armored train the way it would show up in a photograph. Instead, he tried to paint his subject in a way that somehow captured the war machine's essence. And how did he do this? Well, mostly he tried to convey movement by showing multiple images, rather like making a movie by flicking through a stack of photographs or pictures. Why are the soldiers highly stylized and almost identical? What point might the artist be making? Well, maybe he's saying that when they put on their uniforms, soldiers become part of the machine, dangerous, anonymous, interchangeable. So in its way, this painting is a kind of true likeness. It is simply more conceptual than representational or optical. So let's apply this optical conceptual distinction to a Paleolithic work that isn't one of our required images. On the one hand, this is clearly an antelope. We recognize the pointed horns, the long, slender legs. Our eyes see these features right. On the other hand, it's hard to capture every element of an antelope's body with any two-dimensional image. We just can't see an animal from every side at the same time. So this artist has cheated a little by carving the animal in what is called twisted perspective. That is, with the body in profile seen from the side, but the head twisted into a frontal position so that we can see both ears and both horns. Would you see an antelope in nature twisted into this position? Probably not. Do we learn more about antelopes because the artist chose this perspective? Yes. So the artist is sacrificing some optical accuracy for descriptive accuracy. It seems pretty clear that the artist is trying to convey information about the subject that goes beyond what our eye immediately sees. These two Paleolithic works illustrate still more decisions that even the earliest artist had to make. Where do these objects exist in space and time, and where does the viewer stand? We could only see this view of the antelope by looking down from above. But what about the bull? Do we know where it is standing or where we are? This illustration may give you a better idea of what the painted bull is missing. It's missing a ground line, a place to stand, and a horizon line that shows where we stand. These telephone poles are the same height and located in the same place on the page, yet we get a very different impression when the ground and horizon lines are altered. So we've already established that Paleolithic cave painters were talented artists. Is it possible that they left out the horizon lines deliberately? That the bulls were meant to be seen as somehow outside of time and place? We just don't know. So here's another puzzling compositional decision. These animals are placed almost randomly. They face in different directions. There's no identifying vegetation or landscape to tell us where they are. What's more, these animals would not hang out together in nature. Does that mean that the artist placed them haphazardly? Does it mean that they were painted at different times by different people and don't really belong together optically or conceptually? Or did the artist want to convey some deeper meaning by bringing these animals together? All together now? We don't know. The answer could very well be all of the above. In my next lecture, we will continue to explore these issues as we look at more prehistoric work.